It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Nadine Le Cheminant, who is a Salem resident. I didn't put that in my notes, but you should know that, who will speak on her work as a writer and novelist. There are many, many things I could tell you about her. She's a fascinating woman, but I'm only going to mention why she's here. An accomplished writer for many years, Nadine recently published her first novel entitled The Gates of Eden, which tells the story of Josephine Bell. After the death of her father, Bell's family falls from middle-class comfort into poverty and the brutal factory life of Victorian England. Dealing with these hardships and hearing from Mormon missionaries the promise of a better life, she and her mother convert to Mormonism and journey to America to join the Great Mormon Migration. This is a historical fiction. This story actually happened, though these characters are fictional. Nadine has degrees in history and art from Utah State University. As a university writer and magazine editor, she's been recognized with 8 top-tier CASE writing awards and as a public speaker. She has provided communication strategies, and as a public speaker, she has provided strategies to national and regional nonprofit organizations. Nadine's love of the southern Utah desert, which she visited recently, again, the backdrop of much of the Gates of Eden, was nurtured on a bare bones survival trip, during which she walked several hundred miles across Utah wilderness without a sleeping bag or a tent, and as I recall, just a cup for water. That's quite a story by itself. Nadine is related through plural marriage, that's the Mormon term, plural marriage, of her ancestors to Mormon prophets Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Thus, The Gates of Eden is not only historical fiction, it relates in a general way to Nadine's family history. The Gates of Eden is a good book. Now, this is not just facts. This is me advocating. Read it. I did. I was deeply moved by the story because it provided an exploration of the complex motivations of the Mormon migrants as they moved across the United States, many of them going solely by hand carts, almost 2,000 miles. They faced many hardships. There were many losses. We heard earlier this term about the Oregon Trail. This is another story in the great story of the Western migration. So with that, I will end and say, let's give Nadine a warm ICL welcome.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming. Oops, making clattering noise. And can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So thank you, Bob. I came from a large Mormon tribe, and in my family and among people that I grew up with, we told stories. And a lot of the stories that we told and collected were about our ancestors. One of the stories that most intrigued me was about my great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann Barton. And she grew up as a poor girl in Victorian England and joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the preferred term now for the Mormon Church has asked that we use that name and also use the name Latter-day Saints, so I'll be mostly using that term. She left behind a memoir of several handwritten pages, and I was so intrigued by just the bare bones of her life and her experiences that I retired early, and I began to research and write a historical novel about her life. Over a 3-year period, I read hundreds of pioneer journals. I read hundreds of sermons and newspaper articles from the 1850s. And I also walked part of the Mormon Trail. I pulled a handcart, they're pretty amazing. They're kind of like a little 2-wheeled wheelbarrow. And you push and pull them. They were pulled 1,300 miles from Iowa City to Utah up over the Rocky Mountains, holding up to 500 pounds each. So I rode a horse, I rode an old steam engine train out on the coast, and through all of these things I was taking photos, taking notes. I videotaped the steam engine train where it was just this clackety-clackety ride, and you could hear this shrill, piercing steam whistle overhead. I explored the woolen mill across the street so I could find how what the working conditions were for people working in the newly industrialized mills in England. I talked with butter churners and quilters at living history museums, and spent a morning with spinners over at the woolen mill, and Google Earthed my way across the Nebraska prairies. So I tried to get a sense of this world. You have, as a writer, you're trying to build this world, and you end up using less than 1% of your research, but you need to know what 1% to pull out, what details, so that you can color this world. The most poignant experience that I had when I was a researcher was I was driving this lonely little mountain road from the Wyoming border down to the Salt Lake Valley. And as I was driving along, there's a place called Heartbreak Ridge. So I pulled over at the historic marker, and as I was standing there, this rancher came along in an off-road vehicle, and he pulls up and he said, "Hi, my name's Howard." And he said, "What you doing?" And I told him that I was, learning about the Mormon Trail. And he said, "Well, if you want to see the real trail, it's up there on that hill." And he said, "You can see the actual ruts of the handcarts." And so he said, and I looked up and I said, "Well, there's a barbed wire fence there." And he said, "Well, I can take you to a place where you can slip through the barbed wire and sneak up there." And I said, "Well, it looks like private property." And he said, "If you see anybody up there, just tell them Howard thought it was probably okay." So I'm all alone on this road in the middle of nowhere, and I thought, well, why not? So I got in with this stranger. He took me down the road, dropped me off, and left. And I, tried to get through this barbed wire fence without tearing my clothes. And then I walked up the hill, and this is a place, I saw the ruts, and I walked in those ruts. This is a place where these pioneers have walked and pushed these little hand carts 1,200 miles. They know that they're almost there. They can almost taste the arrival of coming to the valley. And they're exhilarated. They come up over this rise, and they see emerging over the top this horizon that's just, this edge to this edge of impenetrable looking mountains. This is the highest, most formidable pass that they've had to go over of the entire trip. Even the Rocky Mountains, it was an easier pass. So they're looking up, and these things, these jagged peaks towering up into the sky. Autumn is coming on. And I stood where my great-great-grandmother stood, and this was the place where they just broke down and wept. So it's been dubbed Heartbreak Ridge. When I retired, I had written a lot of other types of materials, but I had never written fiction. And I had no idea how to go about this. And so my first week of retirement, I sat down with all these how-to books, how to write historical fiction and developing a plot. And I was taking all these careful notes, and it was really difficult. Most of all, it was difficult to find my characters and to write dialogue. And so I would, here's this young girl, Josephine Bell is my character, and she has fallen from grace. Her father was a merchant. He died and left the family indebted, much to their surprise. So she would have been a little bit educated. So I was trying to channel Jane Austen, and everything I did came out so stilted. And I felt like her character was flat. So what I decided to do was find her face. And so I looked at hundreds of pioneer photos of girls and young women. And when I saw her face, I knew that I had found her. And she had a straightforward gaze. She had a face that was vulnerable and yet strong. And I took her image and I put it on my computer screen. And every day before I began writing, I checked in with Josephine. And from that point on, I felt like I began to know her. So when I finished the first draft, I started over. And then when I finished the second draft, I started over. And this went on for some time. And I worked with a lot of editors and beta readers. And finally felt like I got to the place where I felt like it was not, to me, it seemed like not craft as much as lived experience. I felt like I could breathe into the characters. So the foundation, this book, it's inspired by my great-great-grandmother, but it does not follow the arc of her life, although it follows the bare essentials of her life. So my Josephine, she hears the message of the Latter-day Saint missionaries in Victorian England, and she does take this epic journey across the world to America, and she is drawn by promises of a land of abundance. And here, a lot of these people were living in abject poverty. Many of them were working in inhumane conditions in the mills and the mines of England. And they were very attracted by these, by the promised land. It was described as a place where no one would go hungry anymore. So she undertakes this journey, and then she pulls her handcart halfway across the North American continent. When she arrives as a girl, she, in the shuffle for home and for security, she ends up within several months as the second plural wife of a man who was almost 4 decades her senior. This coming-of-age story is, most coming-of-age stories are a little bit more innocent and simple. This story is set against a very complicated, tragic, and colorful 3-year period. I think it's one of the most explosive periods, 3-year periods in the history of the American West. During this time, you have this exodus of tens of thousands of Latter-day Saints from Utah. Many, this first year that they came in 1856, more than 200 people died on the trail. And so we often hear about the Donner Party, but this tragedy was a lot greater than what happened with the Donner Party in terms of numbers. They arrived traumatized, and instead of a land of abundance, this land has been visited with plagues of biblical proportion. And so you've had grasshopper plague, drought, and by the time they arrive, there's a deep famine. And in response to the famine, the second prophet of the Latter-day Saint movement established a Reformation. And he said that this famine was punishment for for people's wickedness. And so church elders went door to door, ferreting out sins. They asked, have you taken your irrigation irrigation water out of turn? Have you lusted after your neighbor's wife or grumbled against the authorities? And thousands of people went down into the waters of baptism to be rebaptized and reconfirm their faith. Part of the Reformation was a new commandment from Brigham Young. He said that polygamy was no longer just an option, but it was now a commandment and required for entrance into heaven. And so there was a sharp upsurge in the number of people who entered into plural marriage. During this time, the federal government sent soldiers marching on Utah to try to stamp out polygamy and to rein in this, what they viewed as this renegade prophet. So as the soldiers approached the Utah territory, people became more and more afraid. These were people who had been chased from state to state to state back east. In one state, the governor ordered an extermination order for any Mormons. They said they can be shot on the spot like a jackrabbit, and there will be no punishment. Their homes had been burned, their orchards, their farms, women had been violated, people had been killed. So when they came out to Utah, they felt like they had finally arrived at a safe, isolated place. And as these soldiers began their march, people began quite worried. The Reformation had a lot of violent rhetoric, and it ratcheted up as these soldiers came closer. There was a lot of xenophobia, a lot of us versus them, a lot of wanting to get revenge. And into this perfect storm comes a wagon train from Arkansas, 120 people, mostly composed of women and children. And they came through southern Utah, where my book is set, passed through this little town, and by that time, the violent rhetoric had reached an all-time high. And it might have been a series of miscues, miscommands, certainly grievous mistakes, but more than 100 Latter-day Saint men went out and slaughtered this party, leaving only the youngest children alive. So Josephine is just simply trying to navigate this very complicated landscape. When we make the transition from childhood to young womanhood or young manhood, it's a pretty complicated terrain to navigate. In her case, it was very difficult because she was a child bride, a second wife, and this explosive background was taking place. In my book, I tried to write with sympathy about this people, about some of the challenges that they faced. I wanted to write with honesty, but I also wanted to write with compassion. And in my book, I attempted to have no villains. I wanted every person in this book to have a backstory. In any movement, there are leaders who are callous, who are led astray, and there are also leaders who were deeply compassionate. And so I wanted to show that these were saints and sinners, sometimes in the same body, and that they were deeply human. I also wanted to show that sometimes they were broken down. They went through a lot of hardships, and I wanted to show that they also had incredible emotional resilience. When rumors of polygamy were filtrating in England, Charles Dickens went aboard a Mormon ship in, I think it was 1858, and he was going aboard to write an expose about these Mormons, and he got on board the ship, and then he came away, and he wrote a beautiful column, and he said, I went on board to try to find fault, but I could not find fault. He said, these are some of the most beautiful, strong people that I have met, and he said, on every impoverished face, I found beauty, and I also found great capacity for hard work among these people. He said they were some of the most orderly people that he had seen. The other thing that is remarkable about them is when you hear about the great exodus west from the Midwest or back east out to the West, it's often a story about rugged individualism. You have these young men who are going out to seek their fortune in the gold fields of California. You also had a lot of farm families coming to settle the Willamette Valley, which was known as the Garden of Eden back east. And these families came as single families or as small groups, but primarily it was somewhat of an individual effort. The Latter-day Saints, by contrast, went across in community as community. They built bridges, they set up ferries for those who came after them, they planted crops for those who came after them, and as soon as one party would arrive from this 1,300-mile journey, they would send wagons and teams back to help parties, the next party come across. When I grew up in Utah, these handcart pioneers are kind of the iconic figures. They are larger than life. They're often put on these big pedestals. And they never, in these larger than life figures, they never sweated. They never got dirty. Their faith never wavered. They were stalwart. They never were broken. And they never felt fear. They never made love. They never argued with a spouse. So I wanted to follow these characters. I wanted to follow Josephine into the parlor where she sat sewing with her sister wife. I wanted to follow her into the bedroom. What happens there? And I wanted to bring them down off the pedestals and make them real people, because that's what they were. I think sometimes when we turn people into great heroes and heroines, they lose their ability to astonish us. They lose their ability to give us awe. So I just wanted to talk just a moment about the history of polygamy in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was established in the 1830s by Joseph Smith, who was the founder of the religion. And he had between 38 and 48 wives. They're not sure exactly how many. One of them was my great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Elizabeth. And she met him when she was a girl, and he sent a lock of hair to her after their meeting, and I think she became infatuated. She talked about his penetrating eyes, and then their paths parted, and their paths came together again later in life, and he confided the practice of plural marriage to her. At this time, and for many years, it was practiced in secret. And he told her that God had commanded him to take her for a wife, and that an angel had appeared with a drawn sword to slay him if he did not obey this commandment. That he had known her eons before she came here, and that he would know her eons. They would be together eons after this life. The problem was she was married, and so she had to think about it pretty hard. But I think she did. In her journal, you just have a sense that she also felt a spark, and she did end up marrying him. So after the Latter-day Saints came west to the Utah Territory in 1852, Brigham Young, I think, probably felt that it was they were safe, that they were in an isolated enough place that they could openly practice what they called celestial marriage. And this government, of course, did send soldiers, and it wasn't until 1890, though, that they gave up this practice. It was in exchange for statehood. The government said, we won't grant you statehood unless you agree to give this up. And so it was banned at that point. There were a lot of families that were left stranded. A lot of women suddenly without a husband, thousands and thousands of children without a father. So it was an extremely painful time. There were, starting from that point, splinter groups who, splintered off from the main group, and because they felt that this had been, that the prophet had fallen away to disavow polygamy. So they continue to practice today in Mexico, mostly the western United States, and up into western Canada. And there are between 20 and 60,000. People aren't quite sure the numbers because many still live in secret, while others live openly. I actually had the most interesting thing happen at one of my readings that took place in the place where this happened, this little town in southern Utah. A woman, there are local communities that practice polygamy openly, and the women have long hair that's down below their waist so that they can wash their husband's feet in the next world, I think it is. They have long dresses, long sleeves. So I was about ready to give my reading, and a polygamist woman came into the back of the room, and she sat with the biggest eyes as I described the pain and the loneliness and the bitterness that are recorded in these journals of women who lived this polygamy. She came up afterwards and waited till everybody had left, and then came and asked me some questions and bought a book and said, "This was really interesting." And she was 20 years old. She was the second wife. So there was a disastrous raid in the 1850s. The federal officials went in order to break up. They wanted to do away with this illegal practice. So they did a raid on a large community. The media images, there were a lot of backlash because you saw images of children screaming, being taken from fathers, wives crying, and the public became quite sympathetic. And the federal officials got a lot of blame and criticism for their actions. So now, even though it's illegal, it's kept at arm's length, and nobody wants to prosecute. What they do try to do is go after when they know about underage girls who are taken in marriage, or where there are financial improprieties by the leaders. Sometimes when you join some of these sects, you sign over everything you own. So if you want to leave the church, it means that you leave your house, you leave your property, and often you're supposed to leave your wife and children behind as well. So many of the women who lived this practice had lives that their journals record a lot of bitterness, loneliness, heartbreak. But there were also women who, although they suffered heartbreak, they also were a bit emancipated by this system. They had sister wives who could care for their children while they went back east and got a degree in medicine, or they could devote themselves to writing. They were also revolutionaries in the fight for women's suffrage. They were some of the front lines in that effort. And Utah became the second territory to vote, to allow women the right to vote after Wyoming. And at that time, no state in the United States allowed women to vote. So the Gates of Eden was set more than 160 years ago, but the themes are relevant in our day. These issues, many of these issues that I cover in my book remain hot-button issues. We still talk about marriage, what form we should allow. We still have evolving ideas about marriage and sexuality. And today, we don't debate about polygamy, but we do debate about gay marriage, transgender issues. We talk about reproductive rights. And so these issues around sexuality and marriage are continuing. They are often very heated discussions. We also have a lot of often heated discussions about immigration. In my book, I tried to capture this whole movement west and the experience that people had we still have people who are pushed and pulled around this globe by incredible suffering, by abject poverty, and by the desire for a better life. And we still, perhaps more now than ever, have this rhetoric of us versus them. And it often gets violent, and it can lead to violent actions. So this xenophobia, fear of others, blaming others, and anger at others, this has continued us. It's part of the human story. It probably will be part of the human story as long as we live. So I think that historical fiction can offer us a deeper understanding of where we are and how we got here. And I wanted to say, if there are anyone in this room who would like to be a writer or would like to write something, whether it's an op-ed for the Statesman Journal or an essay or a collection of something about your life for your kids, writing can be wonderful. Even though I wrote about a lot of difficult events, this was such a labor of love and such an act of joy. Every day when I got out of bed, I was so excited to go and find my characters. And I was so sad when the book ended and I had to say goodbye to Josephine. There's a great magic in words. There's magic in stories. And if you want to write, I think it's important to set up a schedule for writing, and if you need to set rewards for yourself for having written a certain amount, or if you want to set some goals, and also it's important to tell people no. I'm doing this, this is my activity this time every day. It's important to set up a framework for your life that supports your writing. But I think the number one thing that you need more than anything else is you need to have passion for whatever it is that you're writing about. Passion is the most important ingredient. The other thing that I was told by an author, I was at a conference and we were, had all of these workshops every day about developing plot and pacing in your story and how to write dialogue. And so one night we were out, doing the wine and cheese with this esteemed author who was the presenter. And someone said, "So, what's the secret? How do you really learn how to write?" And this guy said, "You learn to write by reading and by writing." He said, "There is no other secret." He said, "It's really nice to come to conferences. It's really nice to get a degree." But he said, "The only way that you can unlock the mysteries of how to write is simply to sit down and write." So this was a book that I really enjoyed writing. And there are little flyers. If you're interested, I have a website. And the website actually has a lot of things that are not in the book. I found archival photos of the journey, photos and paintings of the life in Victorian England. It was kind of a Charles Dickens existence for a lot of people. And then coming across, and there are images of Utah when the saints arrived. There are some blog posts and things like that. So you're welcome to go there and visit. And you're also welcome to order a book through the Book Bin or online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So I think we have some time for questions if anyone has any.
Good morning. My name is Eric, and I don't know whether you are familiar with this or based on your came across this in your research, but in Lake Michigan, there's a beautiful island, Beaver Island, and a Mormon group, and I believe it was a split off from Brigham Young, under the leadership of a Joseph Strang, colonized, are you familiar with that history? Colonized the island. They were extremely prosperous because of the fishing industry. At that time, they founded one of the first newspapers in the state of Michigan. And sadly, many of the mainlanders became very jealous of their prosperity, but also the plural marriages, invaded the island, killed Joseph Strang, and then they later disbanded. I assume they went west. But it's very interesting historically, and it's a beautiful place to visit.
That brings up an interesting point. You talked about people around them being envious of their prosperity. The Latter-day Saints, wherever they went, were industrious. They had a very well-ordered system, and they created prosperity wherever they went. That was one of the reasons that I think there were feelings, persecution against them. The other reason, there were rumors of polygamy that were leaking. And the third reason was they tended to move in, buy up property. Property prices got all warped, and they voted in a block. So that was they did also experience that persecution from neighbors. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Nadine. Bob, you didn't mention in any detail the voyage, but I was struck by how hard the voyage was in the mid-19th century. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, the voyage was the longest westward migration in the world. They started in England. Most of them left the Liverpool and came out through and took the rail from Boston or New York out to Iowa City. And then the people who came across with handcarts during a 3-year period where this was kind of an experiment, and to see if they could bring deeply impoverished people across to Utah for almost nothing. And so it was a very difficult journey. A lot of people died aboard the immigrant ships. And I actually didn't have as much trauma or death in my journey west with the handcarts than my great-great-grandmother's story, because the story arc, I didn't want to have that much hardship before she even arrived and became a child bride. But in my great-great-grandmother's party, there were more than 200 people who died that first year. And they left late in the season. They left with green wood. There were no nails or no iron on the rims of their little wheelbarrows. So they were expected to go up these rutted, rocky roads over the Rocky Mountains across the desert. They encountered a lot of obstacles. And this first year, several parties got stranded in Wyoming. And as the snow got deeper and deeper, many people died of exposure, exhaustion, utter starvation. Many people lost limbs. They lost hands and feet. And my great-great-grandmother, her father died one night in the tent. So she stayed by his dead body until morning. She was too weak to bury him, and the ground was frozen. And so she wrapped up his body and laid it under a tree. The wolves would follow these handcart parties. They would go because their kills were made for them. So every day the wolves would wait at the edge of camp, and when the party pulled out, they would move in. My great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann, she was rescued. There were rescuers who finally got to the party from Salt Lake. She was rescued by Brigham Young's son. He walked by her and he said, "Oh, here's another dead girl." And she opened her eyes and he realized that she was alive. So he chopped her hair out of the ice where it had frozen and brought her back to the Salt Lake Valley, there were a lot of people who arrived quite traumatized, and that first year was a horrible year because of the famine. There were people begging in the streets of Salt Lake and digging roots. So there was a lot of trauma, and I think when you look at some of the violence that happened down in southern Utah, these were people who had been traumatized. So, other questions?
Hi, this is Sally. I read your book off of the computer, and I just struggled along with them. The description was absolutely wonderful, and I would highly recommend the book because of that. But I was a bit disappointed that there wasn't more after they arrived. Most of the book was their journey, but I mean, the description was just incredible. And thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, it was divided into kind of half and half, and the first half was the journey, and the second half was what happened after they arrived in Utah. And I think partly it was because I was new to writing when I wrote the first half, and so I wrote in more detail than I did the second half, and by the second half I felt more just get to the facts. But yeah. It's interesting because in Utah, people always gravitate to the first part with the handcart journey because they are such iconic figures, and so that's the part that I think grabs people's interest.
Hi. When you wrote the book, I haven't read it, but I will. Who's telling the story, and how much did you live in the book, just when you were writing, or all the time, or still?
Yeah, that's a great question. Josephine, it's from her point of view. However, I did want to show something. I wanted to show from first person, and so I wanted to have letters from her, letters home to her sister in England. And in order to do that, I needed her to have come from a middle class or wealthy enough background that she could write, because a lot of the people that she came across with were so impoverished that they wouldn't have had any schooling. She did, and she had enough that she could write, although she did have some misspellings here and there. So it was from her point of view, but by using this author tool, I could also have the first person point of view to begin each chapter with a letter. I also included historical quotes from the time, so each chapter is prefaced by a quote that has to do with that episode of history. And so you have the writings of Charles Dickens and Brigham Young and polygamous wives and apostles and prophets and ordinary everyday people. You also have a pioneer recipe for bread. So, yeah.
Yeah, my name is David. As you know, there were people here before the Europeans arrived, and they pretty much got the short end of the stick. Did that happen in Utah also?
Yes. Sometimes the Native Americans were treated well. Sometimes they were not treated well. And it seemed like it mostly had to do with what was convenient for Brigham Young in advancing his agenda at the time. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, which is the massacre that I describe, after this killing occurred, these men stood on this killing field and they were in shock at what they had done. There were women's bodies, there was blood, there was gore, spread out all over this field with more than 100 people. So they took a vow of silence that they would never talk about this again, that it would never come up. They wouldn't talk about it with their wives, with their church leaders, with each other. And so what they did was they painted themselves with black paint, and they came home. They went out with the black paint so that it would look like the Paiutes had done the job. So when they came home, they were washing off their black paint. And this is one of the things that intrigued me and that I wanted to write about this. If you can imagine vets coming home from war and having this experience of PTSD from perhaps killing someone or seeing people killed, well, this was a group of people who the entire community had been involved in this. More than 100 men had been involved in this. And as this silence descended on this community, I can only imagine the society-wide PTSD, that it would have just been traumatizing for them. They were not able to speak about it for decades, or not able to acknowledge that it happened. I think it was 1990, a very enlightened Latter-day Saint prophet said, we need to own this. And he went down and he invited the members of the ancestors of the Fancher wagon train from Arkansas to come out and meet with the descendants of the Latter-day Saints in that area, and descendants of people who had been involved. And they met, they wept together, and they had a ceremony to commemorate what had happened and to offer forgiveness to themselves and to each other.
This is Karen. I have a couple of questions about your great-great-grandmother. You mentioned that she left one man and married another and entered a polygamist marriage. And you also mentioned that she wrote about her sadness. Was her sadness related to one of her marriages? Was it related to her situation and what she was going through? And how did she get away from that first husband?
Oh, actually, I was mentioning the sadness that I alluded to was in there are hundreds of journals from polygamous women. And so I mentioned the sadness in their journals. My great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Elizabeth, she remained married. So, and she could do that in part because the practice was secret. So she married Joseph Smith and also remained married to her husband for the rest of his life. I have no idea how what he knew, and but there was, I was going to say something, but I forget. Yeah.
This is Barbara. I grew up in southeastern Iowa across the Mississippi River from Nauvoo, so I have always known about those who came west from Nauvoo, but I was several years ago on a trip across northern Mexico and came to a town just below Tucson in Mexico, and I had gone through miles of just trash and awful stuff along the road, and we drove into this town, and it was like I was in Nauvoo again. It was all brick buildings, clean, immaculate, and it was a Mormon settlement there. So there was really a distinct change in what the place looked like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not surprised. Their communities in the Midwest were known to be beautiful. A lot of the buildings were made out of brick, and they were made to last. One of the reasons that they also ran into trouble is Joseph Smith would move into a town and say, this is where God has destined us to be. This is where the Garden of Eden is. I forget the exact. Anyway, this town is destined for us, and locals didn't like that. So.
Hi, Nadine. This is Don. The story of the Mormons as they were chased from state to state because of their beliefs in finally reaching the promised land in Utah. There's something I don't quite understand, because I can see now a similar problem going on at our southern border, where people have been chased away from oppression and whatever you want to call it. But there seems to be a disconnect, because, when the next election, the electoral votes are counted, you can guarantee that these people, the descendants of those who were chased across to get to a promised land, will automatically support the person with that policy. And so I just don't quite connect whether it's completely ignoring history. We were here first. Can you enlighten me at all?
Yeah, I grew up in the reddest county in the reddest state in the nation, and generally they do vote Republican by and large. This was the first election that was not the case. I can't remember what the exact breakdown was, but there were a lot of people who were really torn. A lot of the issues revolve around the Supreme Court justices and abortion, and like they do for many religious groups. And so I think they were weighing this or this. What I have found, and a lot of the news stories and statistics bear me out, that their reception of immigrants is far more kind, more consistently kind than in a lot of places. I think because these stories are so alive in people, they do remember their immigrant background. They know that they're all immigrants and fairly recent immigrants. And the other thing that accounts for that is they have a worldwide proselytizing program. And so when you've gone for 2 years and you've worked for people in Zimbabwe and come to love people who think differently than you, who live differently, who have a different color of skin, you bring those attitudes home with you. And so I think there's a lot of openness towards immigrants, more so than in a lot of places. It's a great question, yeah.
This is Silva. I'm here with the microphone. As a point of clarification, I think you opened your talk by saying you much prefer that the people of that faith and that way of life much prefer to be Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and prefer not to be referred to as Mormons. Is that correct? Is it okay to say LDS as a shorthand? Maybe not.
Yeah, there was the Latter-day Saint, see, I said the right term, prophet in sometime, I forget, in the last year, said that he does not want people to use LDS or Mormon anymore, that those are epithets of the devil. And so he wants people to use the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're having an incredible tough time with branding because there's no web address that can go that long. And so LDS.org, what do you do with that? What do you do with Mormon Newsroom? What do you do with all of the groups that have this short? What do you do with all of their video series over the years? Meet a Mormon. And so all of those things have been shelved, and they've got names that are all over the place. I think it's churchofjesuschrist.org is the main website. Their church service program has gone to, I think, church service program rather than LDS services. If you type in Mormon anything, it will take you to a web address that says Latter-day Saints or Church of Jesus Christ. And so they're just trying to figure out how to rebrand, and it's really, really complicated. And now they have a lot of different names out there that need to be short, and none of the media are obeying. The New York Times still talks about the Mormons.
And the response to the Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon, could you talk about that?
Say again?
The response to the
Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon.
Oh,
From what I understand, people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are the ones with the biggest laughs when they're in. I mean, in fact, I've been in the audience. They're just howling because they get all the jokes. But I don't know if that's really considered a rude show.
yeah. How many have seen that? It is just fabulous. If you haven't seen it, you should go home and Google the YouTube video for, what's the one? Knock, knock, hello. Does anybody?
It's the opening thing. It's when you're calling on people.
Yeah, it's the opening scene. Okay, so these missionaries, and it is just hilarious, and the artistry is so incredible. There's a reason that it was a real long-running play. It's toured, and it's very popular in Utah. I think at first Utahns weren't quite sure what to make of it, because it pokes fun at them, but it does it in a gentle way. And I think they're trying to learn how to poke fun at themselves more too, to own that, they have their own unique ways. And so I think by and large, there was kind of a wondering how to react and then deciding to embrace it. A lot of them embraced it because they just got it spot on. I mean, right now there's a little bit of backlash against that musical for what are perceived as racist portrayals. When I think they're in Africa, the missionaries. So, yeah, I need to go home and watch the whole thing.
Well, you've been incredibly generous of spirit in telling us this huge story with lots of different perspectives. So we thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you so much. And if you are interested, you can get a book at the book bin or on Amazon. So thanks.